A secret confession from a high-ranking diplomat has just shattered the illusion of Chinese strength. They admitted that if Russia fails, the entire focus of the West will pivot to destroy them. This fear is not just talk. It is visible in every empty apartment tower and silent factory across the country.
Over the past 2 years, dozens of Chinese real estate developers have fallen into financial distress.
Trillions of dollars in wealth are vaporizing as the property market hits a dead end. And get this, the leaders are now terrified of their own people. The collapse started in grocery stores and bank accounts long before the world noticed the cracks in the wall. Beijing internal fear exposed. It started with a whisper behind closed doors. In mid-2025, China's top diplomat quietly told European leaders something Beijing had never admitted before. If Russia falls, China is next. The United States would then shift its whole focus to Beijing. That single confession shattered the illusion of strength the Communist Party had worked decades to build. It exposed something terrifying. China's leaders no longer believe they can survive a full Western pivot against them. But this was not just one moment of fear. It was the beginning of a cascade. Because as the cracks in China's confidence spread, so did the collapse. A real estate market is vaporizing trillions. A population is imploding faster than projections. A private sector is suffocating under communism with Chinese characteristics. And a regime is now so obsessed with control that it is strangling the very growth it needs to survive. China's collapse did not begin on the battlefield or the stock market. It began with a secret, and now that secret cannot be contained. But here is what Beijing does not want you to know. The collapse started months before that confession. It started in the grocery stores, the factories, and the bank accounts of ordinary Chinese citizens. By late 2025, something deeply wrong was happening to China's economy. Prices were falling. Not just slowing down, falling. For more than 3 years, wholesale prices had been in negative territory. Consumer prices were barely moving, sometimes dropping month after month. In any normal economy, prices rise. Inflation might be annoying, but it is a sign people are spending, businesses are hiring, and money is moving. But China? China was trapped in deflation. And deflation is an economic horror show, because when prices fall, consumers stop spending. Why buy today when it will be cheaper tomorrow? So they wait. And wait. Businesses see sales collapse. They cut prices to move inventory. That makes deflation worse. Then they lay off workers. Those workers stop spending. Prices fall further. It is a death spiral. Chinese economists started using a new term: balance sheet recession. Households and companies are so buried in debt and so terrified of the future that they refuse to spend no matter how cheap things get. They are not being cautious. They are paralyzed. The Chinese government tried everything. They cut interest rates. They pumped money into banks. They announced stimulus packages. Nothing worked. Because the old playbook, the one that turned China into an economic superpower, is dead. For decades, Beijing's formula was simple: build. Build roads, build cities, build factories, borrow whatever it takes. Growth will pay for itself. Except it did not. Every yuan of investment now returns less and less. High-speed rail lines run empty. Apartment towers sit vacant. Factories churn out products nobody wants. One advisor to the Chinese government admitted what everyone was thinking: fundamental reforms are needed deep within the microstructures of the economy. The entire model is broken. But deflation is just a symptom. The disease goes much deeper and is spreading through every layer of society. The crazy part is how fast this economic rot is turning into a fight for survival. System cannibalizing its own people. China has a new word for what is destroying its economy: involution. It sounds academic, but it is not. Involution is when an entire system starts cannibalizing itself. It is when companies, sectors, and entire industries get locked in a race to the bottom. They pour in resources, slash prices, and destroy each other for shrinking scraps. It is economic self-destruction. And it is everywhere. Take solar panels. For years, China dominated the global solar industry. Panels were supposed to be the future. They represented clean energy, high-tech manufacturing, and a symbol of China's innovation. In 2025, China was able to produce twice as many solar panels as the entire world could use that year. Twice. Factories kept building capacity anyway. Local governments wanted jobs. State banks kept lending. Nobody wanted to be the one to stop. So panels flooded the market. Prices collapsed. Profit margins evaporated. China's top solar manufacturers, companies that employed hundreds of thousands, collectively lost $40 billion in 2024 alone. $40 billion. Gone. Then came the layoffs. The biggest solar companies shed nearly a third of their workforce just to stay alive. Entire factory towns built around panel production watched their economies collapse. Workers who had moved across provinces for these jobs found themselves stranded with nothing. This was supposed to be a flagship industry. Instead, it became a bloodbath. And solar is just one example. Steel, cement, electric vehicles, and batteries are all suffering. Even advanced semiconductors are feeling the heat. All are suffering from the same disease: too much capacity, too few buyers, and companies kept alive only by government life support. These are not just struggling businesses. They are zombie companies. They are dead in profitability, but kept shambling forward by endless debt from state banks. And get this, those state banks are using your money. Chinese household savings, the nest eggs of hundreds of millions of families, get funneled into these walking corpses. For years, Beijing denied there was a problem. Admitting overcapacity would mean admitting their industrial policy had failed. It would invite trade retaliation from countries sick of being dumped on. So they buried it, until they could not anymore. In July 2025, President Xi Jinping called an emergency meeting. The topic was ending disorderly low-price competition and eliminating excess capacity in key sectors. Weeks later, the Minister of Industry summoned solar industry leaders to Beijing. The message was blunt. The price war must end. Underperforming producers need to exit the market. It was a public admission of failure. But here is the trap Beijing faces. They cannot actually let these companies die. Shutting down factories means mass unemployment. Angry workers lead to social instability. So they are stuck. Keep the zombies alive and watch the economy rot, or pull the plug and risk chaos. Either way, China loses as the internal hunger grows. What most people do not realize is that the property market is the next victim. Concrete dreams becoming nightmares. If you think overcapacity is China's biggest problem, you haven't seen what is happening to the housing market. For over 20 years, real estate was the engine of everything. Local governments sold land to developers for cash. Developers built towers. Families bought apartments, often multiple units as investments. Banks feasted on mortgages. At its peak, real estate accounted for nearly 30% of China's entire economy. The mantra was simple: home prices only go up. The government will never let them fall. Then, they fell. What started as a slow deflation in 2023 turned into a free fall by 2024. Giant developers began defaulting one after another. Names like Evergrande and Country Garden once symbolized China's urban boom. Now they are synonymous with financial carnage. Other giants like Sunac, Greenland, Kaisa, Shimao, Logan, and Sify followed. And the debt restructurings? Brutal. Creditors, the people and institutions who lent these companies money, were being forced to accept haircuts of 50, 70, even 80% or more. Translation: if you were owed 100 million, you would be lucky to get back 20 million. Maybe 10, maybe less. In early 2025, Sunac China pushed through a restructuring of 15.4 billion yuan in bonds. Creditors had to accept more than half of that simply vanishing. Then, Logan Group proposed eliminating 3/4 of its bond debt. Sify Holdings went even further, wiping out over 80%. But the real horror is in the details. After paying off bank loans and other obligations, bondholders received 2.25 million yuan, from 700 million to 2.25 million. That is 0.3% recovery. A total wipeout. And it is not an isolated case. Another developer, R&F, had pledged a hotel in Guangzhou to back a bond. When default came, creditors discovered a bank had a prior mortgage and seized the property. Bondholders got nothing. Some experts now say many of China's restructuring deals are worse than outright bankruptcy. At least in bankruptcy, there are legal rules about asset distribution. In China's murky restructurings, developers make rosy promises, overvalue assets, and leave creditors in the dark about what they will actually recover. Trust has evaporated. Foreign investors who bought Chinese property bonds are now warning others to stay away. Domestic creditors are furious. Some have organized protests, demanding Beijing force developers to pay what they owe. The government ignores them. As of late 2025, over 100 major developers have defaulted on some portion of their debt. More than 1.6 trillion yuan in property sector bonds are in default or distress. And here is the ticking time bomb. An estimated 526 billion yuan in developer debt comes due in 2025 alone. That is even higher than the amount that matured in 2024, which the industry could not handle. Who is going to pay it? Nobody. These companies cannot pay what they owe. Not now. Not ever. The Chinese government is scrambling. Regulators have dispatched teams to big developers to oversee risk mitigation. Banks are being told to extend loans and avoid calling in debts. Local governments have quietly taken over some stalled projects to deliver homes to angry buyers. They are trying to prevent a full credit system meltdown. And China's advantage is control. Unlike America in 2008, where Lehman Brothers was allowed to fail spectacularly, China can order banks to hide losses. They order courts to delay bankruptcies and state firms to absorb damage. So we are watching a slow-motion car crash instead of a sudden explosion. But the outcome is the same. Years of property excess are ending in a long, painful unwind. Land sale revenues have collapsed, starving local government budgets. Mortgage lending has dried up. Construction has plummeted, destroying jobs for millions of migrant workers. The ripple effects are everywhere. China's growth is sagging under the weight of a real estate sector that went from unstoppable boom to bottomless bust. But here is the catch. The economic fire is now spreading to their international alliances. World turning against dragon. So China's economy is in free fall. But that is only half the story. Because there is something that makes all of this so much worse. Remember that whisper behind closed doors? In mid-2025, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi sat across from European officials in Brussels and said something Beijing had never admitted publicly. China does not want to see Russia lose in Ukraine. Not out of loyalty, but out of fear. Wang warned that if Russia falls, the United States would be free to turn its full strategic focus toward China. For years, China's public stance on Ukraine had been studied neutrality. They said they were not a party to the conflict. Now, behind closed doors, that facade crumbled. Beijing's greatest unspoken anxiety was laid bare. China cannot afford to become America's sole geopolitical target. This confession sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles, because it revealed something crucial. China's leaders no longer project confidence. They are terrified. And history shows what happens when great powers start admitting their fears. In 1944, as Nazi Germany's defeat loomed, Imperial Japan privately braced for an Allied onslaught, knowing all that military might would soon pivot to the Pacific. In the late Cold War, Soviet leaders understood they could not endure a united Western focus. They sought arms treaties and proxy wars to ease the pressure. The British Empire, after World War II, conceded strategically vital colonies once it became clear it could not face all threats at once. Each time, the admission of weakness came first. The decline followed. Wang Yi's confession is China's version of that moment. And the calculation behind it is deeply cynical. Beijing prefers a protracted conflict in Ukraine, one that keeps Washington divided across two fronts over a quick peace that frees America to focus on Asia, even if it means prolonged bloodshed in Europe. A frozen war suits China. It buys time for military buildup and regional assertiveness while NATO looks elsewhere. But by saying this out loud, China alerted the world to its mindset. The veil lifted. Beijing appeared less like a confident rising power and more like an anxious giant terrified of encirclement. And right on cue, the world started slamming doors. In July 2025, President Donald Trump dropped a bombshell on social media. Any nation aligning with anti-American blocs like BRICS would face an automatic 10% tariff on all exports to the United States. No exceptions. The threat was clearly aimed at China and any country drifting into Beijing's orbit. At the July 2025 BRICS summit in Rio de Janeiro, Brazilian President Lula da Silva fired back publicly. He called Trump's threat very mistaken and very irresponsible. Then came the most blistering line. The world has changed. We do not want an emperor. We are sovereign countries. Lula also pushed for BRICS nations to reduce reliance on the US dollar in trade. Why, he asked, should every deal between Brazil and India or China and South Africa have to use dollars? China's official response tried to strike a cooperative tone. Foreign Ministry spokesperson Mao Ning emphasized that BRICS is about openness, inclusiveness, and win-win cooperation, not confrontation. On Trump's tariff threats, she warned that trade wars have no winners and protectionism leads nowhere. But here is what is revealing. Beijing issued no direct retaliation, no counter tariffs, no threats of sanctions on American goods, just words. A decade ago, China might have answered fire with fire. Now, restraint. And that restraint speaks volumes, because China's economic vulnerabilities make a full-blown trade war exceedingly dangerous for Beijing. The United States remains one of China's largest export destinations. Despite diversification efforts, America buys hundreds of billions of dollars of Chinese electronics, machinery, and goods every year. A 10% tariff or higher would price many of those products out of the market. This would mean factory closures in China and mass layoffs. For an economy already on the ropes, that scenario is catastrophic. Chinese leaders are walking a tightrope. They talk about diversifying trade partners and accelerating deals with Southeast Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. But none of these alternatives can replace the scale and purchasing power of Western markets. Not in the near term. China's factories need Western buyers, and those buyers are increasingly wary as the geopolitical vis tightens. The crazy part is that they are running out of allies they can actually trust. Giant falling from within. Beyond tariffs, a broader technological and financial decoupling is accelerating. The US has imposed sweeping export controls to cut off China's access to advanced semiconductors. Dozens of Chinese tech firms are blacklisted from buying critical components. American and European companies are being encouraged, even mandated, to reduce reliance on Chinese supply chains for strategic goods. Washington is even discussing restricting US capital from flowing to certain Chinese tech sectors. Each of these steps tightens the noose slightly. Individually, none is fatal. Collectively, they threaten to strangle China's future growth. And the timing could not be worse. Just as China's internal engines are sputtering, external pressures are mounting rapidly. After a post-pandemic export rebound, Chinese exports started sagging in 2023 and 2024. By 2025, export growth was no longer reliable. In some months, exports actually contracted. The combination of weaker global demand and rising trade barriers is sapping what was once a lifeline. And when exports slow, factories scale back. Layoffs increase. Domestic demand weakens further. Here is what makes this truly terrifying. Everything is connected. Everything reinforces everything else. Weak domestic demand pushes Chinese firms to overproduce and seek sales abroad. But overproduction leads to dumping goods overseas at ultra-low prices, That triggers global backlash like tariffs, bans, and trade restrictions, which curtails China's export income, worsening the economic slowdown. Lower exports mean factory layoffs and falling wages, which further damps domestic consumption, and that weaker demand loops back, causing firms to lower prices even more and rely even harder on exports, which invites more backlash. It is a feedback loop from hell. And China's policy tools, the ones that worked so well in past crises, are now useless. Cutting interest rates does not stimulate borrowing when businesses see no profitable opportunities. Fiscal stimulus is constrained by local governments drowning in debt and infrastructure projects that yield diminishing returns. Currency devaluation could make exports cheaper, but it risks capital flight and would be viewed as an aggressive move by trading partners. The classic levers Beijing used to pull are either unavailable or impotent. Meanwhile, time is running out. Every month, more mortgages sour. More graduates enter a job market with no openings. More factories sit idle. More families watch their life savings vanish in property investments that will never be completed. Youth unemployment has reached levels Beijing no longer wants to publish. They stopped reporting the numbers for some time because the figures had become too embarrassing. Small protests have started popping up. Disgruntled homebuyers are demanding refunds for undelivered apartments. Laid-off workers from state firms are protesting unpaid benefits. Even sporadic bank runs happened when rural lenders were rumored to be insolvent. The Communist Party has long derived its legitimacy from one promise: delivering prosperity and stability. What happens when it can no longer guarantee rising incomes, affordable housing, or secure employment? The central government knows these dangers. It responds with a mix of crackdowns and concessions. Dissent is quashed quickly. Censorship of economic bad news is tighter than ever. Financial whistleblowers are silenced. At the same time, Beijing offers mild stimulus like small cash handouts in some cities, subsidies for electric car buyers, and support for startups. But these feel like band-aids on a gaping wound. The structural issues tower overhead: colossal debt, aging demographics, a governance model that stifles the private innovation needed for the next stage of development, and a more hostile international arena. Every element feeds into the others. Geopolitical tension, economic stagnation, industrial overcapacity, and financial stress are not isolated problems China can solve one by one. They are an interconnected web. This is perhaps the most alarming realization. Beijing faces not a series of challenges, but a systemic crisis. In the fall of the Soviet Union, military overstretch, economic malaise, and loss of ideological confidence all reinforced each other in the 1980s until the entire structure collapsed almost overnight. China in 2026 is vastly different, but it too is confronting a convergence of perils that test the resilience of its system like never before. China's leaders still project confidence in public. They reassure that risks are under control. But the tone has unmistakably shifted from triumphalist to defensive. In September, Premier Li Qiang emphasized stability above all, but the subtext is clear. The boom is over. The priority now is preventing a bust from tearing society apart. President Xi Jinping and the party elite show no inclination to liberalize as a solution. Their instinct is to tighten political control and double down on nationalist rhetoric. They speak of self-reliance and the resilience of China's socialist system. Admitting the need for fundamental change would be ideologically inconvenient. A personal repudiation of Xi's decade of centralized rule. So the likely course is controlled retreat. They will patch financial leaks to avoid banking crises. They will stimulate here and there to stave off outright recession. They will blame external forces like the US for economic troubles to divert public anger. And quietly, they will inch toward restructuring. They will allow some zombie firms to fail while managing the fallout. They will encourage mergers in bloated industries. Will it be enough? Increasingly, Voices within China's own technocratic circles suggest the old toolkit will not save the future. Some compare the current trajectory to Japan in the 1990s, a long, grinding stagnation. Others fear something worse, like a financial crack-up or severe recession that shakes the regime's stability. What is certain is the margin for error has never been smaller. One wrong move, a mishandled bank failure, popular backlash to unemployment, or a foreign policy misstep triggering sanctions could ignite a crisis the party struggles to contain. China stands at a fateful juncture. A great nation that once seemed destined to overtake all rivals is now hemorrhaging momentum. A confession of strategic fear revealed cracks in its geopolitical armor. A cascade of economic disasters like deflation, overcapacity, and a property meltdown exposed rot in its development model. External pressures tighten the vis, and feedback loops of decline turn faster. History teaches that great powers often falter from within before they are defeated from without. The mighty Qing dynasty was brought low not merely by foreign guns but by internal rebellions and fiscal bankruptcy. The Soviet Union crumbled when its people lost faith in a stagnant system. If China cannot rejuvenate its model and restore confidence both at home and abroad, it too may face a similar fate. A slow unraveling of the miracle culminating in a transformative crisis. For now, the world is watching. The implications are enormous for the global economy, power balances, and the millions of Chinese whose lives were transformed over the past 40 years. The party will do everything to postpone the reckoning. Yet the image of spreading cracks is impossible to dispel. As one Chinese proverb goes, a dying camel is still bigger than a horse. Even in decline, a great entity remains formidable. China's collapse, if it comes, will not be simple. It will be complex and epochal, with aftershocks felt around the world. The secret fear admitted in Brussels may mark the beginning of that process. The moment China itself recognized that the forces bearing down on it could no longer be contained by business as usual. A storm has gathered over the Middle Kingdom, and its outcome may define the course of the 21st century. Is this the final fall of the economic dragon, or just a temporary setback? What happens to the world if China actually stops growing? Like and subscribe for more deep dives.